Hi everybody, it's Carmen Geddes. Welcome to 10 Sisters TV. I'm super excited. We're continuing on with our Quilted Jacket Series. And so I wanted to show you that I've got all of my pattern pieces quilted, and I wanted to just show, just to acquaint you with the process. I created the fabric for each pattern piece of my jacket. So these pattern pieces might look a little different depending on what jacket pattern you are using. And I've got my pattern piece cut out of the fabric, and then I've got my batting. This is a very lightweight fusible polyester. I think I've concluded that the most economical and to get a really nice weight of jacket is flannel, and pre-washed plain flannel gives a great weight. It's kind of the same as what I'm using here. So if you're making a jacket for the winter and you want it to be really warm, then you can use batting. So lots of great options. And then I've got my backing, which is also the lining. And so kind of taking the whole concept of quilting a quilt top, but we're breaking it down to pattern pieces. I did straight line quilting on the sewing machine, just about 1/4 of an inch away from each of my seams, just vertically on this. So, and then we are going to cut this out. You can do it with a rotary cutter carefully, or you can just cut this out with scissors. So we're going to just cut each of these pattern pieces out, just keeping in mind that if you do have notch or registration lines on your pattern, that you're going to cut those out, or mark them with a water-soluble pen would be a good idea. And so you're just going to cut out these pattern pieces. Basically at this point in constructing your jacket, you are going to follow the instructions on your pattern, on whatever jacket pattern you are using. And so I'm not going to really give too much instruction on putting the actual jacket together, because we could all have a different jacket pattern that's going to go through different steps. And so what I actually want to talk a little bit more about in today's video is how we want to finish off the seams of the inside seams. And so here's the main body of my jacket. And so I have actually, the only seams that I have sewn here are my 2 shoulder seams, and a little bit hard to see with this beautiful fabric that's my lining. But I've sewn these shoulder seams, so I want to kind of talk a little bit about how we're going to finish these off. And so one thing that might, if you are typically a quilter, not a garment sewer, one thing that's a little bit hard to get used to is a 5/8 seam allowance. A lot of clothing patterns are going to call for a 5/8 inch seam allowance, and you do want that, right? That's going to make a difference in how that shoulder fits. Definitely going to make a difference with how a sleeve fits, because if we take a 1/4 inch seam allowance, for example, on a shoulder seam, it's not going to create a big enough hole for your arm that the actual pattern is calling for, if that makes sense. So you want to use the seam allowance that is called for. But on this first example, I'm going to show you some binding. So we're going to show you some examples of how we can bind the seams, the seam allowances on the inside of your jacket. Sometimes on my jacket, I'm actually going to do just a dark navy that's not going to really be a contrast, but sometimes the binding can be a really cute focal point on the inside of the jacket, so you want it to be. But I want to show you a couple little tips that I think are going to make a difference. And so if we can see this, I want to show you that I have taken a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Well, I don't want to bind a 5/8 inch seam allowance. I want it to be basically a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now, so from your seam line, you could take a ruler and actually mark that 1/4 inch and then cut there. I'm going to eyeball. I'm going to do a nice full 1/4 inch seam allowance that I'm going to cut. I don't want this to be scant. You do want some seam allowance. You don't want to cut that seam allowance away. So basically, cut that away. Now, the other thing that's a factor when we are sewing with quilted fabric is that it's going to be more bulky. And so there's a term in sewing that's called grading the seam allowance. And basically what that means is so you've got your 2 layers, right? We've got our front and our back piece here. The one of them we are going to keep at that 1/4 inch seam allowance, and the other we're going to, and I'm just going to, you're basically just shaving off a little bit of that bulk. And you don't want to go all the way down to the seam. Let me hold that there. So do you see how we're just kind of trimming off a little bit of that front piece? And it doesn't seem like much that we just shaved off a little bit of that, but by grading the front part down, so notice that the back is still that nice full seam allowance, but by just shaving off a little bit off of that front edge, you know, it's almost like almost a little beveled, you know, you're holding the scissor at an angle. By just shaving off a little bit of that edge, it's kind of amazing how much bulk that takes away from your finished seam allowance. And so that would be my suggestion on those inside seam allowances. So let's talk a little bit about how we want to bind this. So typically when I am, let's see, we're going to do this one. So when I am going to bind a quilt, so for instance, I'm looking at this jacket as kind of like a quilt. So when we put binding around the outside edge of this, I'm going to bind this jacket just like I would a quilt. I am going to do a double folded binding, right? And I'm going to just, you know, make a traditional binding for the outside of this jacket. Because we have curves on this jacket, even if it's just around the neck, I'm going to make the binding cut on the bias, just because that's going to give me a lot more ease of movement around curves. Sometimes the bottom of your jacket might have a curve in it. So that's my suggestion. So this is for the outside of the jacket. So to finish off the inside seams, I don't necessarily want that much bulk, right? Because remember that we are binding, you know, 2 layers of the quilted fabric when we're binding the inside seams. So I don't necessarily want to have these 2 layers of fabric as the binding. And so I'm actually going to do a contrasting thread here, or contrasting fabric, a little bit easier to see. So I'm actually going to create a single folded binding. And so this could be something that you could buy pre-packaged. You know, they've got it where the binding is folded, you know, center is folded in on both edges into the center. That, I guess that does give you a double layer of fabric still. So if you're doing a pre-made binding that has both outside edges folded in, I would actually press one of those out. So it will look like this. So just the one edge would be folded and the other edge would be straight, if that makes sense. Now, you can buy those in different widths, and I haven't really looked at them for a long time. I think it's really easy just to make your own. And so that's what I'm doing. So I like a single layer that has one edge folded over for us to finish off that binding. What I found for binding those inside seams was a 1 1/4 inch strip. That's the size that I chose. You could kind of play around with those widths. Now we could take this and let's see, I've got all these fun tools in a small space. So let me get my iron out here so I'm not melting anything important. There we go. We'll turn that on. So you could take that strip and just carefully fold over that nice healthy 1/4 inch on the one edge and just press this down as you go, right? Just backing up a little bit, we'll talk about this again when I am creating binding from fabric. I like to make sure I starch that fabric beforehand. Just helps it press really nice, and it just gives it some really good body, a lot easier to manage. So you can do it that way. I've got this handy dandy little bias tape maker that I have probably had for 30 years, you know, and every few years I pull it out for different reasons. This one is a clover and it has the number 25 on it. I've determined it's made, these little tools are made to do that binding that's going to fold both the outside edges in, just like you would buy at the store. And this is meant for probably a 1 1/2 inch strip. I've cut my strips 1 1/4 because what I want is to have one side not be folded and the other side to fold. And so this is kind of a neat little tool. And again, we're going to have the iron right here. So then I'm just going to back up. Sometimes see how the other side started to fold? So I want to just kind of adjust my little strip and make sure that I've got it. So I've got it so it's like laying flat on this side, and this side is coming up over the edge, meaning that's going to fold over. So it just makes it a little bit easier managing through. And you know, this 1/4 inch that we are folding over, we want to try to keep fairly consistent if we can. Oh, I got cords, there we go. And so you can just create that nice little finished edge as you go through, which is pretty handy. So you do kind of need to adjust, get back over there where you're supposed to be. There you go. All right, so that's kind of a nice little easy way to create that one-sided bias binding that is folded over on the other edge. And so after we have created that, we are going to, now I'm going to get my iron out of the way. All right. So what if my sewing room was actually just this big? I would be in so much trouble. I do like to spread out. All right, so let's get the sewing machine in a little bit better view here. So now I've got my, get mine. Here's my shoulder seam that I trimmed down to 1/4 inch. And then I've also graded that one little seam allowance to make it a little less bulky right on the edge. And I'm going to, so here's my binding strip that I have created that's got the one side folded down. So the side that just has the raw edge is the one that I'm going to bring over. Now, if I lay it on top of where I'm sewing, well then I can't see my seam. Now I could just trust my 1/4 inch seam allowance, because that's basically, I have trimmed the seam allowance to 1/4 inch. But I'll tell you, if you just line this up, let's see, let's get it right. I've only got this much. Let me just cut this off. This is where I've got it folded. that will be for the other one. So I'm going to put right sides together. I mean, this is a solid, but basically I'm doing right sides so that here's my folded edge of my binding, and then I'm going to turn it over. Now you can pin this in place if you want, but I'm going to just match up all these raw edges. Now, when I do that, I actually can see the seam line. And this does a couple things. It's going to ensure that I'm sewing the binding on right where I want it, and it's also double stitching that shoulder seam of a garment. And so, you know, that's probably one of the most vulnerable spots as we put, you know, jackets on and off. So I like the fact that we are giving that a little bit of extra stability. So then we're going to bring this over to the sewing machine. Matching up those raw edges, we're going to line this up so that it is, I'm sewing that seam right on the same seam line that I sewed my two front and back together, the shoulder seam, right? That make total sense what I'm saying? And I don't think you need to do a back stitch on here. I think we're good. Okay, now let's get this a little bit bulky. So now I've sewn this nice little binding piece on the front side, and I'll show you my favorite binding trick of all time. This has just changed the way that I bind big time. I'm going to take my glue bottle with I'm using the Elmer's washable school glue. Now you can get different basting glues. You want to make sure that they are water soluble. I use the school glue because I know it is starch based and it is water soluble, but the important thing of using this glue is making sure that you've got a little fine tip. This is a little craft tip that I bought that actually happens to fit right on the Elmer's glue bottle, but I went online and found tons of these awesome little empty bottles with a nice little fine tip. So what we're going to do, got my iron handy, is we are going to just give a little nice bead of this glue right on. This is how I bind my quilts, by the way. My whole machine binding class is free. You can access that right here on 10 Sisters TV. If you go to 10sisters.com and go to the tutorial tab, you'll see all our videos are they're the same YouTube videos, but you can access them right from the website also. So I put a nice little bead of this water-soluble glue right on the seam line, and what's nice is then this binding is going to just wrap around, and we're going to have this binding just go right on top or right past the seam line. But what's really important is that we are going to heat set this with the iron. Now this is doing two things. It is drying the glue, right, which we want it to do, but it also is fusing this to the fabric that's underneath it. And so this is the prep I do. I machine sew my bindings down. I think I already said that. You can check out my machine binding class, and you can check out this part where we do talk about the glue. I like to really give this a really good heat set because then this is not going to move at all. And so now we're going to just trim this off. So now you've got a couple of choices. This is a nice time to just come in and machine sew that, hand sew your binding down if you like to do that. We can also come over to the machine and either top stitching from this side that is fused, or coming on this side and doing a stitch in the ditch to actually sew this binding down. And so it does create that little piece, but just, you know, wearing the jacket and just the movement, this is going to decide which way it wants to fall. But this is a really great way to finish off these inside seams of your jacket. And like I said, on my jacket, I am actually going to do a dark navy, which I'll show you in a minute. But I wanted to use this. That color would actually be a really cute contrast. It just picks up that color inside. So you can use the same fabric that you're binding the outside of your jacket with to finish off the edges. Now the other option would be using an overcast or a zigzag stitch on your sewing machine, or if you have a serger, you can serge these edges. Sometimes I like to use that on the inside seam of my sleeve, right? Because nobody's going to see that. And so do I want to go to the trouble of, binding that whole seam? So see, I'm just admitting how lazy I am in my sewing. Anyway, and so this is a great way. So you're going to do this on all those exposed inside seams of the jacket as you construct it. So join me next time. We're getting closer to getting this jacket finished. So I'm going to go ahead and finish off my inside seams and put this jacket together, and then we'll be talking about outside binding next. So if you are new to 10 Sisters TV, check out the links below. We've got links to a few other videos in our jacket series. Our website is 10sisters.com. We'd love it if you would like and subscribe to our videos. That really helps get the fun word out there about all of our 10 Sisters videos. So we'll see you next time on the Quilted Jacket series.